see you back.
Hey, thank you. Okay, so call us to order.
Chair Glines.
Here.
Members Hintermeister,
Here.
Hutchison. Here. Lovelace.
Here.
Oliver.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Okay, first item is the report of the chair. I just want to say I was at the Thursday, June 21 meeting, and it was budget and the financial audit, and basically it was the Edmund report, and it's amazing to me anyway how the budget is. We're totally, we're a Habittat agency, but the revenue, we're completely dependent upon people building stuff. But if the people who are out there building stuff, they're being charged, and we're putting it to good use. And then the other thing, during your report, are you going to be talking about the proposed Pacheco Reservoir?
No.
Okay.
I don't know. I know what you guys know. Yeah.
Okay, well, the only thing
Yeah.
I know is that the state, I don't know if it's the water agency or which, maybe there's some dam agency, but this was of the 8 projects that went forward from Santa Clara Valley Water District. The Pacheco Reservoir was the top rated one. It got $248 million, or it was promised $248 million, and that was the half the money. And so maybe next time you could give us an update on the timeline, best case scenario in
Oh, for Pacheco Dam?
yeah.
I could try to get somebody from the water district here.
Yeah. Or they could just,
Yeah.
feed you for the
Sure.
other. But it's gonna have, one, it's a new source of water, but it also, and Julie, you might know, that not everyone from the greater environmental world is convinced that's the best place to put a reservoir.
Yeah, I think I know probably just as much as everybody else does in terms of the environmental groups. I think it's Sierra Club, right, that has issues. Committee for Green Foothills has not been following it in the sense of engaging with it. As a matter of fact, it was a question, though, that I did have for you in terms of endangered species. I mean, I've heard sort of a bit of both sides, but I don't have a comprehensive view of this project. So it would be very interesting from the Habitat Agency point of view to know where, how we are seeing it from our perspective.
Yeah, it's not a covered project, so it would, unless we amended our plan, which is a whole long, arduous process unto itself. It would impact us some, because I was on that property, that's Rancho El Toro, which we tried to acquire.
To buy.
There's 38 ponds on the property. I don't know if any of the ponds would be affected by the project. I'm assuming some would. It's the best riparian habitat on the property. It was Cedar Creek, I thought, and that's not being impacted by the dam. It had a beautiful sycamore alluvial riparian. It's a decent riparian. It's sort of a narrow canyon as it goes up Pacheco beyond the existing dam. And yeah, there would be impacts for sure. I don't know what impacts, and it would be speculative, but it is modeled habitat for all the amphibians and the turtle. So those would be the ones most likely affected.
Okay, and so they would have to go through the state. They can't piggyback on our HCP.
No, unless we amended the plan, right?
Okay, all right.
Yep. And like with high-speed rail, how they would mitigate that it is important that we're not in competition with the water district for mitigation lands.
And if, just so you could answer this just as a larger question around that dam, I'm not clear whether, I mean, I understand this would be the biggest dam that the water district essentially would have. I mean, it would surpass Anderson.
Correct.
I'm not clear on, despite the large capacity, I'm not clear on all the benefits of it, aside from essentially just taking the water that's already sitting in San Luis and moving it here. It's not, it's moving it here and therefore it's closer to us. I'm not clear as to whether, what are the greater benefits. If it's just a movement of water, we're not getting more water, we're just securing the water closer to home.
I know NIMS will definitely, so NOAA Marine Fisheries would be probably, that's an issue that would be, if the dam gets built, there would be a condition of environmental flows for steelhead primarily. And in theory, I guess they could benefit yellow-legged frog. But yeah, the plumbing of it, I don't know, no comment.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
not like, okay,
Yeah.
we're making room in San Luis, they can put more water.
Right.
And now we've got greater capacity here, but that doesn't increase anything we could get from San Luis. It's like, because there's allocations, right? So
Right.
it's not like we're getting more, we're just, like I said, shifting it closer to home.
That's my understanding,
Okay.
that it's a shifting of, and it provides,
resources placed.
maybe emergency storage, I don't know, but I'll try to get someone from the water district.
It would be
Yeah.
interesting to understand,
Yeah.
because that is an incredibly costly dam. And yes, there will be some environmental damage. So what is the benefit? What are we giving up for, what's the benefit for this?
Yeah, for the gain.
Yes,
And-
exactly.
And I don't think that really has been talked about in the news stories that I've read, that there is no net gain in water.
Yeah,
for
and
this
so that's
area.
why I'd like to understand a little bit better, where do they see the benefit in just holding it closer to home? How do they?
Yeah,
Holding it, or were they actually collecting it there?
So from my understanding, it's just going to be piped down from San Luis, and we're going to hold it there. So that's why I said I'm in no way well-versed on it, so I'd like to understand
I
better.
think they said 2028 or 2029 is when it should be completed.
Oh, yeah, sort of online, yeah.
Yeah,
So yes, it would be nice to have a more comprehensive
yeah,
report
sure.
as to that one.
The existing dam provides some irrigation water for ag downstream.
Negligible.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Yeah.
And the spillways collapsed, so they can't even keep water. The Department of Dam Safety has told them they can't fill the dam up all the way because of the spillway is not functioning. So I know part of it is what do you do with the existing dam, and how do you repair that or whatever. So, and I know that water district doesn't have the money to do anything. That's part of the narrative too. But I'll talk to Garth Hall, who's one of the leads for the water district on this, and I'll try to get somebody from the water district to give a presentation about the dam.
Thank you. Does anyone else?
I'll shoot for the November
Yeah.
meeting, yeah.
Sounds good.
Anyone else have any questions about that or suggestions? Okay. Then if we could start over with Kyle and come this way. So, and along with, if you have anything for the greater good.
The Santa Clara County Fair is going on right now. So if you want to go see the youth of our county, they're there.
And the cattle and the livestock and the,
Yeah,
and the chickens and the,
everything.
yeah. And you can get the pepper steak sandwiches of 10 years ago.
I guess. I hope they're not from 10 years ago.
Same recipe. But they're using ribeye.
Yeah.
Which is unbelievable based
What,
on,
sorry, Walt, what kind of sandwich? You piqued my interest. So.
it's a pepper steak sandwich.
Pepper steak sandwich, okay.
And it's been gone for 10 years, and the two sons of the gentleman who did it forever, but I'm very active in the Garlic Festival, and they use a ball joint meat, not the joint, but the meat around it. But it's far less than a ribeye, which if you go to Costco, anywhere between $10 to $13 a pound.
Okay.
For choice.
Okay.
If you go to the fairgrounds, there is a small building a little further at the back. It's called the Pepper Steak. It served at one point in time as a famous little
Place, okay.
place, yeah, for the locals to go to. Yeah.
All right. Mr. Oliver?
The only comment I have is, in my relationships with all things Morgan Hill, we are in a quagmire and have no idea what we're doing as a city for housing and the affordable housing. We're really at kind of a standstill point as we try to understand what the state wants us to do and how we do it, and how it affects us in the business world as developers. We just don't know. So it's going to be interesting to see.
SB 35.
Yes. Well, and it's even, and besides 35, that there's, Morgan Hill is not in compliance right now.
Well, that's if you look at the list, I think there was 11 or so jurisdictions that were in compliance. The rest of them either fall under the 10% or greater or 50% or greater, and Morgan Hill falls under the 50% or greater.
Yeah.
Is that across the state or in the county?
Across the state.
Only 10?
Only, I think 10 or 11 across the state.
Oh.
Yeah. Napa County was one that made the grade, but most of us didn't.
And Morgan Hill is quickly running out of land currently zoned for R1, which is single-family residential. And I don't know if the city's identified their revenue source when they stopped getting those impact fees. And to me, that's not planning.
Walter, the more interesting aspect is that with Measure S, an initiative which sets confines what the city can do, how they mesh that with HB 35 and the state requirements, they just don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
It's going to have a court action, I guess, to determine whether the state law trumps an initiative. We just don't know the answer to that.
No, I'm sure we're not the only city. And Palo Alto just this week voted, I think it was this week, or was it late last week? It was this week, Monday, 5-4 to scale back on their commercial. Cut it in half, basically, the commercial that they had planned on, because I'm sure they're going to start looking at their general plan and where they're going to be putting housing in terms of meeting up with that. So there's a lot of I've talked to some folks in Mountain View. Everybody is sort of trying to figure this one out.
Which could impact, I guess, our HCP fees.
Potentially, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of fees. Joseph?
Yeah, so the Santa Clara, I guess the Silicon Valley chapter of Green Drinks meets in downtown San Jose the first Friday.
Is that St. Patrick's Day, green drinks?
No, it's green for environmental, and usually held at some sort of a bar or an establishment where you can meet and have a drink. Green Drinks this month, it's Sierra Club talking about soil quality and conditioning. Last month we had Our City Forest. The month before that we had Ron Dearden Jr. who came in and talked about high-speed rail. It's a great meeting. We have almost no attendance. And if anyone's in downtown San Jose on the first Friday, it coincides with the Art Walk. We start at 6 o'clock at Cafe Stritch on the first Friday. There's a little meeting room upstairs. And Cafe Stritch has good iced tea and lemonade, other beverages, and good food.
Other beverages are
Yeah.
white.
Other beverages.
And if someone wanted to find out more, what's the key word that they would search for to find it?
Santa Clara Valley Green Drinks.
And Joseph, if you would like, I could speak. I've spoke to Kiwanis. I was at the Cattlemen's Association meeting last month. So if you in need of a speaker
I appreciate that. If it's
Sure.
okay, I can put you in contact with the person who organizes that.
Yes.
We're booked out through the end of the year. There's a possibility that I might take a more active role in its progress next year. And so maybe we can all get together and talk about a date.
Perfect.
Thank you. That
Yep.
would be awesome.
Well, you're welcome.
Well, since you brought up high-speed rail, I believe the chamber is going to be hosting a high-speed rail meeting come August 14th in the morning, and it'll be right here. So just an FYI.
And there's also a meeting in Sacramento, the governor's office, or not his office, but.
Yeah, I'm invited to that one.
Are you invited to
Yeah,
that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, Andrea and I are invited. I don't know if I'm going. I put it on my calendar, but it's on the same day as the Morgan Hill one.
Okay, well, I'll report back, because I know you'll be dying to know what they say here versus what they say.
I'm not sure I'm going there. Maybe I'll come to this one. It's going to be right here in the council chambers, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Julie, just a question on that. Does the HCP have to collect a fee for the work that the high-speed railroad does through the,
No, it's like the dam. It's not a covered project. Yes. But we are in coordination with them. OSA is also, some of the environmental groups are, to make sure what they're doing is compatible with wildlife connectivity. People are concerned on its impact on ag land, primarily farmland, but also some of the ranches in Pacheco Pass will be affected by it. And also to make sure it's not in conflict with the conservation goals of the HCP. Yeah. And so far, so good. At least the staff we're working with is very collaborative, from high-speed rail. I know the cities have issues independent of what our issues are.
At our Green Drinks gathering where Ron Dearden Jr. spoke, he talked about the other sort of outlying benefits of high-speed rail. And along with high-speed rail comes this whole concept of connector rails and trying to tie together the rail system to link, completely making a circle with the VTA. And this is all part of the sort of their secondary plans, but once high-speed rail comes in, there is a secondary plan to create rail transportation up and down the coast, connecting to as far as Salinas, Monterey, and then inland into Gilroy, and then up the peninsula as well. And so along with high-speed rail comes this whole rail network that's almost...
It makes sense.
Right.
Monterey's been watching this for a while.
Okay.
I remember meeting folks back in Gilroy years ago. They were following the high-speed rail station in Gilroy because of their wanting that kind of connectivity, bringing up their rail line.
Okay, and then Julie, if you could give us a shameless political plug?
I've announced my candidacy for District D for council, for city council.
Oh.
District D, for those who don't know, is everything east of the 101 in Morgan Hill that's in the city.
101.
Yeah, so
Okay,
up into
got it.
Jackson, Oaks. Yeah, over on Cochrane.
Over by Nordstrom, the school and stuff.
All of that,
Okay.
over by Cochrane, all,
Okay.
Coyote Estates, the new Borello construction,
Okay.
all of that, yeah, that's all
Okay.
in the city.
Well, good luck.
Nothing to add.
Go ahead.
Yeah, nothing to add.
Okay, and then I think I said before, but I too will be on the November 6th ballot for Gavilan College, representing West Morgan Hill, West San Martin, and West Gilroy, all the way down to almost the end of the city limits there. So it's a long finger. Okay, so.
Actually, I will add one other small piece. It's somewhat related to the Habittat plan in that it's in Coyote Valley, and it has to do with also Gavilan College. So Gavilan College has a bond measure, and they did have within it expenditures at their Coyote Valley campus, and we were pleased that the Board of Trustees put in the measure that they would keep it to the current footprint in the current 15-acre footprint in Coyote Valley, and not use the bond funding to expand to the second phase.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we had a discussion with the superintendent and then council and their chief of operations, and we found a path forward. They brought it forward to the board that night, and the board agreed with it. And we also got language in essentially the preamble, if you like, the resolution,
Yeah.
which recognized environmental sensitivity in any of their planning.
Well, that's great. Yeah, that sounds like a good compromise.
It was a livable compromise.
It was,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, and then do we have anyone from the audience, Doug and all, who would like to say something for the good of us all? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to, if I could get a motion and a second to approve the minutes of the May 3 meeting.
I so move.
Just two really minor corrections. So on, let me see, page 6, so in number 4, the fiscal year 2016-17 annual report, the first sentence, Principal Program Manager Tara Donovan, there's just a period missing at these. Like I said, it's minor. It's just a period missing at the end of that sentence. And then on page 7, under Land Acquisition Reserve System Update, that heading, you'll find the first, well, there's bullet points and there's a first sentence of Chair Glines. In the second sentence, beginning with third sentence, he also thanked. Just delete the in front of Tara. She's super important, but
Wrong title.
but yeah.
Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
Do you have a second on that motion?
Yes, second.
And so, Calero baseline inventory and restoration assessment.
Yes, and we have Heath here to present from Nomad Consulting, and he's going to talk about the work they did out at Clara, rare plant surveys, looking for amphibians and restoration opportunities.
And we have lots of frogs out there now.
There's frogs out there. Yeah, thanks for having me here. Glad to speak to you guys today. Always appreciate the watchful eye of the public from all angles. So, yeah, we are also thankful for being able to work with the Habitat Agency on new land acquisitions and helping them try to identify the goals they've met through these acquisitions. But just, I guess I'll start. I'm assuming you guys have little video screens or?
It's in front of you. We
Yeah,
can see
okay,
it.
yeah. So I'm Heath Bartosh, founder, principal of Nomad Ecology, and we're in Martinez. And we're full-service biological firm, so we do plants, animals, wetlands, permitting, GIS work for, mapping activities. And we have a fairly long working relationship with HCPs, starting with the East Contra Costa HCP. We've been working with them for about 10 years now. And we, in addition to the Habitat Agency, we've also been working with the San Bruno Mountain HCP folks. So we're pretty experienced and also really experienced in Bay Area biota. So the other principal project staff on the project, besides myself, were Aaron McDermott, who led the habitat assessment, the stream habitat assessment, and Megan Bishop, who holds a permit for handling the federally listed critters that we're out looking for, particularly amphibians. So I'm sure all of you are aware where Calero is. It's an existing county park. The Habitat Agency secured the easement on a greater part than just the county park, and it's just on the eastern flank of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And also is abutted by a couple other regional parks, as you know, Rancho de los Osos, and Almaden Quicksilver County Park, which isn't too far away either. As far as our scope of work, we basically were asked to do covered wildlife surveys. So as a part of that, we went around and looked at a bunch of or all of the ponds that are out on the Calero conservation easement and assessed the habitat of the ponds, so characteristics like vegetation, water quality, and whether or not there's woody debris in them that provides habitat for certain animals, particularly western pond turtle. But what we're really focused on was red-legged frog, California tiger salamander, and western pond turtle as part of the wildlife surveys for the ponds. And then figured I'd throw this in here just to show you guys and remind everybody, including myself, what the conservation goals are for the HCP or the VHP here. Quite a bit of acreage here that's needed to meet those goals. And for instance, the California tiger salamanders protecting 195 acres of breeding and primary habitat, and then secondary non-breeding habitats 41,000 acres. So in order to identify that you have protected those, you actually have to have some breeding populations, and so that's part of what we were out there doing on Calero. And then you can see the habitat acres for red-legged frog, foothill yellow-legged frog is stream miles because they're more of a stream-dependent species, and then western pond turtle there too. The other part of the work was covered plant surveys, and that's my expertise, is rare plants and botany. And as a part of that work, we were asked to do some habitat mapping. So what's important for the serpentine species here in this part of the world is the serpentine rock outcrops, and that's particularly important for Dudleya, the stone crop succulent that is federally listed. And then we also mapped wetlands and ponds as a part of that. One of the interesting things that we did with that effort was to utilize some multispectral aerial imagery that was flown specifically during the August time period last year, or was it last year? Yeah, last year, about a year ago. And we used that aerial imagery to help us map serpentine rock outcrops and some of the, one of the particular plant species that is covered by the habitat plan. And the aerial imagery was really high resolution, and it allowed us to automate mapping of these things, which cover large areas and large acreages out on Calero. So it was kind of a novel approach and really helpful for what we were doing. The secondary part of that was the covered plant inventory. So we were targeting the plants covered by the habitat plan to see how many populations are out on Calero and to essentially count the number of species because of the habitat goals or the biological goals associated with the habitat plan. And then on top of that, we're just doing floristic surveys, which is essentially being able to identify and understand if there's any other plant species out there that may not be covered plants by the habitat plan but are otherwise rare in terms of statewide rarity or maybe even local rarity. So we recorded those too. And here's the goals and objectives for some of the or all of the covered plants that are associated with the habitat plan. And in the middle column, it tells you how many occurrences or populations that are necessary for the habitat plan to protect, and then how many individuals each one of those occurrences must have in order for it to be considered healthy and qualify as an occurrence. So I'll get into some of that detail a little later. And then the third part of it was a stream habitat and restoration assessment. So the stream habitat assessment was specifically focused on foothill yellow-legged frogs. As I mentioned before, they're more dependent on the streams, but we also assessed habitat for those streams to potentially support red-legged frogs because they can breed and at least move through stream systems. And then tricolored blackbirds, which if you have large enough stands of emergent vegetation like cattails and such, they can breed in streams as well. And then the second part of that was to do a restoration assessment. Look at these streams, see if there's any potential for restoration activities to occur on the stream reaches or the riparian areas, and there was some attention paid to pond habitat as well for the stream restoration assessment. And there's a table there for what the biological objectives are for the habitat plan in terms of river and riparian forest and wetlands and ponds. So lots of acres of riverine and riparian forest, 290 acres, and that's important to note because one of the recommendations that we had as part of our work was to maybe modify a definition of a vegetation type to help the Habitat Agency secure more acres just by a definition change. Right, there's the north side of Clara there, late in the summer. Okay, so result-wise, before we went out there to do our work, there was actually no occurrences of red-legged frogs known from Clara. There was 3 previous records of tiger salamander from the vicinity and 2 western pond turtle observations out there. And this map shows where those occurrences are prior to us getting out there and doing the work, what had been known previously on Clara. And so there was only a few things there. The blue dot is western pond turtle, and the yellow ones are the California tiger salamander. So as part of the wildlife habitat assessment, we surveyed 18 ponds and found a variety of habitat characteristics. And then also, of course, there's some threats that are out there that threaten the potential long-term viability of some of these populations. And so we go over that stuff here. But there's the locations of all the ponds, so each blue dot represents one of the 18 ponds. And you can see they're pretty evenly distributed around Calero. But as I mentioned, there's a variety of different sizes and habitat characteristics, so you'll see some of the ponds there in the top left. They're pretty sizable, but some of them have algae blooms on the surface. Some of them have margins that are vegetated with cattails and tules, and others are just small seasonal wetlands that were likely stock ponds that were created back in the 40s and 50s to help water the cattle out there. So they range in size from maybe just as big as this table to as big as this room. And all of them, provide some habitat, but not all of them were supporting populations of listed amphibians. The threats that are important to note are in the top left there. You see a couple of bullfrogs hiding on the shoreline. Those are known to predate the tadpoles and larvae of red-legged frogs and California tiger salamander. And I wasn't out there doing the habitat assessment for wildlife, but I ran into a ton of bullfrogs out there, and that they're probably, the source population is probably the reservoir, because bullfrogs prefer perennial water sources, ponds that don't dry out in the summertime. So I think that's probably a big reason why there's so many bullfrogs out there. And then there was a couple locations of red-eared sliders, which are non-native turtles that end up, people have as pets. Sometimes they get released in the wild, and they can be a nuisance in terms of eating tadpoles of amphibians as well. And then Megan was out there doing some sampling one day and came across a bass fisherman while he was out there and fishing one of the ponds at Calero. And so bass can also eat the young of the salamanders and frogs out there, and so those are also, a potential threat out there. Feel free to ask any questions at any time, by the way. Sure.
There's a bunch of serpentine rock on the east side of the highway. Is it the same kind of serpentine rock in the Claro area?
More or less. I mean, I think it probably, serpentine has a origin from the seafloor, so it was probably accreted during different events, but it's more or less the same in terms of plant habitat and composition. Yeah.
When we hear reports on the burrowing owl in its downturn in the population. And one thing that keeps coming up, there's been some success in other areas of bringing in breeding pairs. Has that been looked, is that a possibility with the tiger salamander and the, in the, whatever it is, red-legged frog?
There's always a big concern about genetic contamination when you're bringing genotypes from one geographic area to another. I suppose that's something that could be looked into depending on what the source population, where it comes from and then where it's going. But I think that might get some resistance from the wildlife agencies because they really are not too fond of moving animals around in that sort of way. But it's definitely...
So the population is not at the critical point?
Of being endangered of
Yes.
completely going into extinction?
Right.
Not at that point, but local populations are, some are more threatened than others. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Other questions?
And I'll do my best to answer the wildlife questions, but I'm,
No.
if you don't have
you're the plant
stamens,
guy.
pistils, and anthers, I'm not really your guy. But the results of the pond surveys were that we didn't find any red-legged frogs, so there were no red-legged frogs there previously, and we didn't find any during our surveys, so that says one thing. We only found one pond with California tiger salamander when there was reports of 3 in the area. So, that you couldn't really say something significant about trends, but it is interesting to look at and begs for some future monitoring in the near future. And we did find the 2 ponds that had western pond turtles. So those guys are there, alive, and doing well.
And just quickly, the restoration ponds that we did, Heath did not survey those. So there is a tiger salamander population at that pond and at the wetland. The wetland is a little shallow, so will it sustain over time? And there are pond turtles but since we already knew everything about that, we told Heath not to survey those ponds. But this is the rest of the park.
So, go ahead. If I remember correctly, and I may not, the red-legged frog will travel a fair distance. So if those ponds become, say, friendly enough, like there's possibility for migration, right, from the ponds?
Yeah,
And what about the pond turtle?
They migrate too. They have different migration patterns than the salamander will go about a mile, a little more than a mile. So if there is stepping stones.
So they go pond jumping?
Right. The red-legged frog about 1 to 2 miles. The pond turtle, I don't know how far it moves, but do you know?
I mean, they nest, they don't, as far as I know, they don't do a great deal of dispersal or migration. They have pretty high site fidelity.
You find them in
homebodies.
riparian corridors too, and there's more of a chance that they get moved with water flows in riparian corridors. But
Yeah.
but I don't know as much about them. Yeah.
All right, thank you, sorry.
My recollection was that in the restored wetlands that we've done, we were going to be doing bullfrog control.
Correct.
Is any of that going to be extended to existing ponds in Clara? What's the plan? Is there
Yes.
some plan there?
So I liked a lot of Heath's recommendations. The problem is it's still not enrolled in the reserve system,
Right.
so the easement hasn't been. We've had some challenging negotiations with county parks, to be blunt. But once it's enrolled, because I can't be spending money on the property if I don't have the assurances that the property is going to be enrolled. So unfortunately, not at this time, but a lot of the things that Heath's team recommended, I read over his report. I thought it was very practical, and a lot of the recommendations were feasible. And I thought it was a very good report. And so the short answer is yes, but not now.
Right,
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Anyone from the public? Back up.
Okay, so where the white arrows are is where the two pond turtles or the pond turtle populations and the California tiger salamander populations were found. So the green dot is where the salamander was, and the other two dots with white arrows are where the pond turtles were observed.
So just one question, looking at the terrain from that perspective, how likely would it be that they would migrate from any of the, because, sorry, back up the chart,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks. The other white circles are the other ponds?
Yeah, so the other circles are the other ponds, and it probably is hard to see, but it also tells you where there was bullfrogs and other critters that were found there.
So there is potential.
Yeah, there's definitely potential, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so some of the recommendations that Ed was alluding to here is berm repair and spillway restoration. So some of the berms out there on Clara for some of the ponds were in disrepair and eroded away and weren't holding as much water. So not only would that benefit the species, but also benefit the water opportunities for the cattle out there. Bullfrog control, of course, is a big deal, but that would take a huge effort, I think, given that Calero is there and always has water.
And excuse me, would the bullfrog control be the bullfrog control that we talked about at a prior meeting?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Or get your marksmanship going.
Exactly.
And then bullfrog control from a drainage structure perspective is basically finding a way to drain these ponds at the end of the season so they don't get the bullfrogs hanging out there year round, which they don't prefer. So if you drain a pond and it's dry, the bullfrog's got to have somewhere else to go. Installing basking habitat for pond turtles might help them migrate to other ponds where they didn't have basking habitat, because they're reptiles and they like to be by the water, but they also like to work on their tans, get warmed up a little bit. And then, of course, some of the ponds were, over years, some of these stock ponds built back in the 40s and 50s, like I mentioned, and they just get silted in, and so they don't have as much water holding capacity, and that is important for when these amphibians lay their eggs, they have to have enough time to metamorphose underwater and to go from tadpole to larvae to adults. And if there's not enough water in there and it dries out before that can happen, then it's almost like a population sink. So that could be one of the things that's going on there too, is that eggs are being laid, but animals aren't surviving because the ponds dry out too fast. And then, of course, the other thing is just, let's make a pond. See if we have an opportunity for pond creation out there, and it seems like that there is, because there are quite a few seeps that are out there as well.
So would the ponds that you create, would you be looking at seasonal or perennial that you're trying to attempt to put?
Seasonal would be the ideal. If the idea is to get amphibians to breed there and have stable populations, then it would be seasonal water. Okay, so moving on to plants, the habitat mapping, using the methodology that I had described with the aerial photography and automated through geographic information systems, we ended up mapping 116 acres of serpentine rock outcrops, which was pretty high, although there is a lot of rock out there. And then the table shows the amount of wetland habitat that we mapped. Basically, the first one, coastal and valley freshwater marshes, is habitat or ponds that had cattails and tules coming out of them. There was 3 of those. Then there was just 12 ponds that had didn't have any emergent vegetation. They were just ponds that were more seasonal in nature. And then seasonal wetlands, there was 2. Then there was quite a few serpentine seeps, and some were too small that we couldn't really map an area around them. So We just gave them point locations, and then for some of them, they were large enough to where we actually were drawing polygons around them too. So quite a bit of water out there, especially in the serpentine areas. But at total, all that wetland habitat was about 9.15 acres. Then the covered plant surveys for the species that we were after, we found 16 populations, and of all those populations of different covered plant species, it was, we estimated about 17 million individuals. So one of those species was basically had the bulk of that number, and that was the smooth Lysingea, which is an annual plant and very abundant throughout Coyote Ridge and Morgan Hill area. Basically, where the habitat plan is, this thing grows on serpentine.
Excuse me, on that last slide?
Sure.
That if you're going to use it again, you might want to think about a thicker font
Gotcha.
on there in order to have it pop out.
Got it. I mean, yeah, that's pretty small. So this table here shows on the left-hand column the number of existing occurrences prior to us doing our work, and then the number of existing occurrences that we were able to confirm, and then the number of new populations that we found. So it was about 5 new populations of covered plant species that we found, but there was a lot of information already known about Clara in terms of rare plants that had been entered in the California Natural Diversity Database. So there's some of the rare plants. On the top left is the fountain thistle, and then to the right of that is Santa Clara Valley Dudleya. And then on the left in the middle is the Loma Prieta hoida, which is a pea family thing that grows in the understory and riparian areas. Underneath that is the woodland woolly threads. It's a mouthful. But that isn't a covered plant species, but there may be some mitigation agreement with Santa Clara Valley Water District related to that plant species, so we were asked to include it and do surveys for that as well. And then there's the most beautiful jewel flower in the bottom right, that's a handsome looking plant right there. And then this one, smooth Lysingea, it's hard to get a picture of something that's like about wafer thin. So that's the plant on the left, but what made us able to map that from aerial photography is you look in the bottom right, you can see the reddish hue sort of out on that point, and just in the foreground in front of the chaparral there, you can see those red stems. That's the smooth Lysingea. And so having current aerial photography that was high resolution allowed us to really be able to map that pretty easily and estimate the population size. So this map here shows all of the serpentine rock outcrop in the pink, and so that was also done using the aerial photography interpretation, and actually worked out really well. And the dots, the green and yellow dots there, are individual colonies of Santa Clara Valley Dudleya. And this map shows, in this case, the pink is smooth Lysingea, which is, where that grows is more or less where the serpentine areas are. And then the other stars and diamond shapes are other populations. The stars are the woolly woodland threads, and the diamonds are the most beautiful jewel flower. All right, and so the other thing, like I mentioned, we did floristic surveys for other rare plants that aren't covered by the habitat plan. And the one thing that we did find in addition to the covered plants was this serpentine leptosiphon, which you can see pictured there in the bottom right. Just a couple populations of that, but it does make nice color shows too. It's pretty abundant, and definitely an obligate serpentine species as well. So when you get serpentine, you capture a lot of other diversity and species richness there. All right. So for the habitat assessment, the stream habitat assessment, which I mentioned, we focused on foothill yellow-legged frog, and The results of that are basically that we found, we made 2 observations of foothill yellow-legged frog on 2 Category 2 streams. And that was over on, let's see, I remember the name of that creek there. Yagas Creek. So those Category 2 streams are basically streams that are perennial or at least intermittent, but connected to perennial water sources. So that's probably the reason why the foothill yellow-legged frog was found out there. They need require fast-moving water, pretty clear streams in order to breed, and that's their preferred habitat. But we didn't find any red-legged frogs nor tricolored blackbird breeding habitat in any of the streams. And most of the streams on Calero are really just intermittent or ephemeral, so they'll carry water after the rain, immediately after the rain, or for a little while after the rain during the rainy season, and that's it.
It says 2 Category 1 streams, so it is 2 Category 2 streams.
No, it's Category 1.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, sorry.
Hey, excuse me just a minute. Doug, did you have something you'd like to bring up now or a little later?
No, later is fine.
Okay, thank you.
And the white arrows there are showing the 2 streams that foothill yellow-legged frog were found on. So that's Yagas Creek and its tributaries down on the south side. It's actually a really nice spot.
Jan has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the tricolored blackbird. So there have been reports for years of tricolored blackbird at Calero, but I think that's probably then down on the reservoir itself.
Correct.
And it's not in the stream areas that we're surveying here. Or
Correct.
Particular, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can see the boundary, the red boundary was our survey area, so we didn't quite get onto the
Yeah, I see.
onto the reservoir. And the rest of the streams, the blue streams, those are the intermittent ephemeral streams that are pretty much what the majority of Calero has going through it.
Hey, Heath, when you talk about occurrences, you're talking about observations within a area defined by a boundary of a quarter mile, right? Or is it?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right, and I should have mentioned that before, but thanks for bringing that up. So most of the animals or plants that are associated with the plan are covered by the plan. The definition of an occurrence or population is the distance of a quarter mile. And so you have 1 population and 2 populations if that is the distance that's met, with the exception of Santa Clara Valley Dudleya, where there was a internal memo that maybe you guys have seen about the populations there being more or less determined by whether or not they fall on discrete rock outcrop areas. So if there's a rock outcrop that is separated by a discontinuity of habitat, because those species don't really move off the rock, those are considered separate populations. So in that, if you think back to the picture, the map of the yellow dots and the green dots showing the Dudleya, those are actually 2 different populations, but they're not quite separated by a quarter mile. Okay, so here's some of the pictures of the 2 streams that had yellow-legged frog on them, and you can see that, there's plenty of shading, there's pools for the frogs to hang out and hide in, and the bottom left picture shows some swift-moving water. It keeps it clean and aerated. And then also, I think in the Bay Area, one of the more telling things about a stream system is when you see this sedge growing in the middle of the rocky bottom there. It's torrent sedge, and it's got to have a lot of water, perennial water, for it to grow there. So if you see that in a stream system, oh, that's a pretty healthy and vigorously moving stream system. And then there's just some shots of foothill yellow-legged frog tadpoles and a couple stages of metamorphosis there, all the way to adult in the bottom right. Okay, so stream habitat and restoration assessment. Basically, the recommendations there for foothill yellow-legged frog were bullfrog control, and because that's, probably the biggest theme out there on Calero for the amphibians. And then the second thing is seasonal access restrictions. So on one of the stream crossings, it's just an open ford that's near some breeding habitat. And so what we had recommended was either a seasonal closure for the stream, or potentially putting in a a light-duty bridge, clear-spanning bridge that would go across the creek and wouldn't harm the breeding populations during the winter time, and would be free travel any time of year that you were allowed to drive on Calero, at least. And then the habitat restoration assessment, first of all, was the recognizing oak riparian. And so one of the things that we noticed is that if you have a riparian corridor, a stream, and it's got oaks along that riparian corridor, technically that doesn't qualify as riparian habitat as the habitat plan is written right now. And so it provides the same, oaks provide the same functions and values as, say, a sycamore or a willow or an alder that grow along the stream, which the habitat plan counts as riparian, but oaks do not. And so you'd be able to up the acreage of riparian habitat within the preserve system, even for stuff that's already been acquired, by just changing that definition, because the functions and values are essentially the same. So meeting the goals would be a little easier for riparian habitat if that were done.
Sorry, that would take an amendment, would it not? Or, I mean, how involved would something?
It's a great question. It could be an interpretation, which with recognizing that within the stream zone you have valley oaks, live oaks, and that it's serving the same function as a willow, riparian, or sycamore alluvial. But I don't know. It's a discussion we've got to have with the wildlife agencies. Yeah, on whether we can just do an interpretation, clarification memo. If we have to do an amendment, then that's a bigger deal.
Did we have a specific goal or a goal specifically for like sycamore riparian?
Yes.
So this kind of designation wouldn't change that?
No.
We still got.
Correct. And we have a specific goal for willow riparian too. Yeah. Heath and I weren't around when the plan got written, but I don't know why they excluded oaks, because oaks are an important part of a riparian corridor in most parts of California, that have this kind of habitat. Yeah.
I think that's a ICF
Bias?
or part of their authorship, because we've seen it in other plans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would it have anything, and I'm just guessing here, anything to do with disease? Oh, I'm sorry. Am I on now? Yeah, thank you. Would it have anything to do with disease of the trees themselves, anything that they might carry?
No.
Okay.
No.
So why that particular bias?
I think because it may have something to do with perennial versus intermittent.
Okay.
And a bias towards riparian being on much wetter, more perennial type creeks. But, we're in California, it's dry. And in terms of species movement, like for red-legged frogs, they'll disperse in any riparian corridor during the spring season, especially if they've got cover to move and, cooler temperatures. So those oaks serve just the same purpose. It's just, I think it was maybe overlooked. So that's one thing. And then just to your point about the sycamores, they're a category of their own, because just outside of the habitat plan, sycamore woodlands are considered rare by state of California's Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that's why they're important and called out on their own. The other thing that we recommended was increasing canopy connectivity along some of these streams. And so maybe part of the reason why some tiger salamanders or even red-legged frogs aren't moving to areas where they aren't living right now is because they don't have enough canopy cover or connectivity along streams where they have that cover that they can disperse. So we identified some areas where it looked like there was some potential to do some oak planting and riparian canopy establishment in these stretches of streams that didn't have anything, any trees growing on them whatsoever. And then, for some things, maybe some cattle exclusion fencing for some areas where, after monitoring, that they're found to be places where the foothill yellow-legged frog like to breed continually, or in places where you want to get some emergent vegetation growing in some of those stock ponds that don't have them already. Fencing off part of a pond could be a benefit. And then, invasive weed mapping and removal is something that should always be done when you're dealing with preserve management, and just to make sure that weeds aren't getting out of control and any new weeds aren't becoming established from a habitat value perspective or a grazing forage perspective. Just because, it's great to have wild oats out there and yummy stuff for the cattle to eat, and if that gets converted to something else, then the forage value and the habitat value goes down sort of hand in hand.
When you fence off those places with the cattle, are you recommending when it's dry to graze it off? Or just
the cattails and such?
whatever you're fencing off, just time grazing so it just doesn't become a giant weed? Holding?
Yeah, that depends on the hydrology of the pond. So if you have something that probably stays wet for most of the year and has cattails and tules, there's no need to really graze those off.
Yeah, they're not going to mess with those anyway.
No, but there was one particular pond that I saw that it would be great to actually just put some goats or cattle in there or something, because there was a non-native grass that was basically choking the pond out. You couldn't see the surface of the water. And so that grass, if it were allowed to, and this is another thing in terms of the weed management stuff, is that this grass, if it becomes established in another pond, then it's going to completely cover the surface of the water, and it may provide some cover for some of the amphibians and things like that, but it really starts to change the chemistry and the dissolved oxygen and all the other factors that are important for amphibian and turtle survival. So in some cases it's hammer that with some cattle, but each pond is a little different, and one of the main things, the cattle exclusion fencing that we were talking about and recommending too, was also that because sycamore alluvial woodland is a special vegetation type in its own, that maybe where there are stretches of sycamores that are starting to recruit or look like they're expanding, throw some fencing on there for a little while, seasonal, and let those things come up and get a little taller and more robust, so they can put some trunk girth on them and then wouldn't be so susceptible to flooding or cattle grazing or tromping. And that picture in the bottom right is sort of sets that scene. You can see in the just on the other side of the pond, there's some smaller sycamore seedlings there that just to ensure their survival and expansion, potentially putting some fencing up around those areas might be something to consider. And then up in the top left, you can see that C3 stretch of a stream. There's sections where it doesn't have any riparian canopy, and that could be a spot where you could put in some riparian canopy. And then the picture on the right shows that the one side of that drainage, that ephemeral or intermittent drainage, is sort of lacking a canopy, and you could potentially put some trees on the left side, the left bank there, to increase canopy cover and riparian cover over the stream. And then in the bottom left there, same thing is true for that pond number 4 there on B6. You could potentially put some plantings of oaks or bay trees or something that would connect to that existing canopy that you can see upslope there. So increasing the cover and hopefully allowing for more dispersal to and from a pond for critters. So just to round it all out here, there's no doubt that Clara has really high floristic diversity. It's in my line of work, getting to be able to go and do surveys on a property like Calero is one where you kind of pinch yourself, is like, this is great, there's so much fun stuff to look at, and it was a beautiful spring and the wildflower shows, and you know, at the same time you see some of California's rarest plants and California endemics, which is also very cool, and to see them doing so well on Calero, shows it was you know, it's a good easement and adds a lot of value to the preserve system. It supports special status reptiles and amphibians, but there are opportunities for restoration and potential management to encourage those populations to expand and flourish a little more than they are, because at least for the tiger salamander and certainly for the red-legged frog, they're on the ropes. So trying to you know, encourage some restoration opportunities and bullfrog management, and then also pond maintenance and things like that would go a long way to at least try and give them a nudge in the right direction, push them in the positive trend category. And then that, you know, only comes if there's continued monitoring. So, you know, whatever the monitoring cycle is, making sure that it gets employed at regular intervals, so you know that the populations of the plants and animals that are out there are meeting the conservation goals and objectives that are part of the habitat plan. So it was great. Looking forward to the next opportunity. And yeah, if you guys have any more questions, I'd be happy
Well,
to
let's
answer.
start with any from Doug.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, committee members and staff. For the record, my name is Doug Muirhead. I live in Morgan Hill. 4 things, from the simple to the impossible. And we'll start with the simple. I believe there was a comment just made about invasive species being concerned about grazing management. One of the interesting things from a talk that Don Rocha of County Parks gave to OSA on fire management is what happens when you have fire crews descending on you from who knows where. And they do their job, and then they go away, and sometimes they leave stuff behind that you don't really want. And so the whole issue of keeping everybody aware of invasive species, both the import and the export. So that was something that was triggered by a comment that was made. In the first part of the presentation, under recommendations, you had a line item, berm repair and spillway something. You talked about berms, you didn't talk about spillways. The only spillways I know of are associated with dams. If there's another kind, you know, please say something. Which leads into a middle level comment, which is, the Water District just had its first public meeting on Calero project for seismic retrofit. I wasn't able to attend that. It might have been a scoping meeting, but I guess I'm interested if you have first impressions on how that construction work might affect what you're doing in Calero. And then the big thing, which maybe you don't want to try and answer tonight, but there seem to be different organizations coming up with different toolkits to do assessments. There's a stream and river organization whose name I forget that has a toolkit. The state at the state level has a California Rapid Assessment method the Water District uses. And so if there's a short answer of what you do versus the approaches of some others, you know, that would be interesting to me. I don't know if it's interesting to the committee. Longer term, perhaps a discussion of assessment methods might be of interest to the committee. It would be of interest to me. So those are the things that I kind of picked up on in this very nice presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Well, I'll answer the Clara one, and then I'll have Heath answer the assessment methods. The dam is a covered project, the seismic retrofit of the dam. And the the water district will have to mitigate any impacts to serpentine habitat, just like they're doing out at Anderson. I think, and Heath can confirm this or not, I think it depends on where they put staging areas, and it depends on where they, the footprint of the project is, but I think most of the serpentine and none of the ponds that I'm aware of are close to the dam footprint. So I can't answer that question specifically, but I don't think it's going to have as much of a potential detrimental effect to rare plants as Anderson Dam potentially could. The Water District is doing their best to kind of minimize impacts to Coyote ceanothus and some of the other rare plants out there. But it's just the nature of where that dam is situated versus Calero. But Heath knows that property probably better than I do now because he was out there on that beautiful spring day. So, but they'll have to mitigate for any impacts to whether it's serpentine habitat or just annual grassland or whatever it is. So we have to sort of stay neutral on this stuff. The Water District is one of the co-permittees. It's kind of very black and white. If you follow the conditions of the plan and you pay the fees, we typically don't get involved. But maybe something we can bring up to them is bullfrog control in Clara, but that might be a Herculean task that would be impossible. So.
As far as the spillway comment, we're not talking Lake Oroville here, but basically an outflow on the other side of a berm. So not a hardened structure, but just a place where water can flow out if the pond gets too full. And then the comment about, I definitely see the point about vehicles coming in during a fire and, potentially bringing in weeds if those dozers or cats or whatever, creating defensible space during a fire or fire breaks. Would be ideal, but unfortunately, I think sometimes with the emergency situations, it's all hands on deck, and that's a difficult thing to control, but certainly something to consider. On the other hand, for when restoration projects are happening and any sort of activity that can be managed in a calm and timely manner, weed abatement of vehicles and construction personnel, boots and tools and things, especially with Phytophthora concerns, that's something that I think is always prudent and becoming more regular. We work with PG&E on a lot of construction projects and restoration projects, and now they know the rub about all that stuff. And so washing vehicles before coming onto a preserve or natural site is something that's become a little more, they've become a little more accustomed to. Actually, it might also be an opportunity for me to just mention that one of the other things that we do a lot of is post-fire research, floristic research, and one of the things that we've done with state parks over the last few years in Sonoma County and Contra Costa County, in fires that they've had on their lands. But one thing that state parks does not do is reseed after a fire, unless it was in an area where a dozer came in and created a fuel break, or there was actually some active management going on. But that's one message that I've worked with our partners at state parks and other parks districts to get that message out there, like, hey, it's not a good time to reseed. It's never a good time to reseed. The resiliency of these California ecosystems is very high, and so they bounce back really readily. So introducing seeds from potentially other areas that have a different genetic identity than to what's local is something that should really be avoided at all costs. So if that were to happen on one of the preserves, it's something to take into consideration. And then the monitoring and the assessment techniques, as far as the pond assessments and the stream assessments, part of what we did, or the majority of what we did for the habitat assessment part was establish U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protocols for habitat that yellow-legged frog and red-legged frog and CTS are, those habitat assessments are associated with. You collect certain data and using certain forms and such. But for the stream assessment, that's more based on, for restoration activities, it's more based on the expertise of Erin McDermott and her career in restoration activities. But, there are certain things out there that we've seen used as baseline monitoring assessment protocols like CRAM at the state level, which I forget the acronym. Do you?
California Rapid Assessment Method.
Yeah, so there it is. And we've seen that used with some success and some not. It's really not a one-size-fits-all, I think, as people would like it to be. So
Definitely, I agree.
yeah. There's other ways to assess habitat. We're actually working on one that we're hoping to be a long-term and Bay Area-wide project on amphibian surveys to look at actual water quality at a little more in-depth way, and plant species that grow in the ponds, if they actually have an effect on when you have certain amphibians present or not. Because plant species is not something that, aquatic species are not something that's really paid attention to in most habitat assessments for these listed amphibians. So trying to think outside the box and see if we can learn a little bit more by looking at things that aren't so typical, or at least atypical in habitat assessments. So,
Thank you very much.
yeah.
Do we have any other comments?
I just had a kind of a general question.
Mm-hmm.
So, it sounds like this presentation is really providing, or the work that was done is really providing a baseline for the ponds that will eventually become part of the reserve system. Is that really what we're hearing here?
Yes, that was our intent.
Yeah.
And also restoration opportunities.
So
Yeah.
when we do, like, or even with our existing, the restoration activities that we've already done at Calero, what is the monitoring plan long-term? Do we go back every 5 years or 10 years or something like that?
Yes.
And
I don't remember, sorry. But the plan lays out but through adaptive management, that may change. If there's a CTS hybridization problem in Clara, which there currently isn't, but if that started to become a problem, that changes what we're supposed to do. If climate change the big question I have is why generally there's not very many red-legged frog known occurrences in the western part of the plant area. We've found them in Coyote Ridge, we found them on Richmond Ranch. So the question I have is why is they're absent from this landscape? And sometimes it's just the right type of habitat, it's just not there for them. He did a good job telling you how some of these ponds just aren't really functioning very well for that type of species. But, so what's going on in terms of if there's an invasive plant problem, if there's an invasive animal problem, how's climate change, hydroperiod. So adaptive management will inform how we manage those sites over time. There is a monitoring protocol, and we're supposed to, and then there's just plain like permit requirements. There has to be so many ponds occupied by these different species by the end of the permit term. And it's a very black and white thing.
Yeah. Is the habitat plan or the agency required to prepare management plans for individual preserves or preserve areas
Yes.
aggregated into?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a management plan that we just submitted to the wildlife agencies for Coyote Ridge. So we would do one for Calero too.
And
when
that's
it's-
something that's a document that has the monitoring protocol and the
Correct.
periods and.
Correct. Yep. And I'm sorry, I just don't remember what they all are, but each species has its own. Some you don't do much with, but others, yeah, it's much more intensive.
So this is kind of a picture of today, plants and animals. Calero's been around a while, Uvis has been around a while, Chesbro's been around a while, even, Anderson Coyote. So has something like this been done in the past to see, count, list what was there to compare to today, that we can, extend backwards?
Both of us will try to answer that. There has been, Heath referred to the CNDDB, so there was some sort of survey work done out at Calero. There was some, at Coyote Ridge, I know there was some known occurrences of the plant, but not to the level that Heath has done, as far as I know. Now, county parks, if Don Rocha was here, he could answer this and say, yeah, well, or maybe Jan, if they did more intensive work out at some of the county parks. So I'm not aware of it being done to this degree, but Heath may know better than I.
I can add a layer to that, just that in the development of the plan, ICF went and did a huge effort in trying to catalog and understand the existing conditions and number of occurrences of all the covered species associated with the plan, so they could build what they thought were reasonable biological goals and objectives. So if you have this existing number of occurrences for species X, by the end of the third term, then it's reasonable to assume that you could have this many populations after securing so much land. So that's how they developed a target. So there was a comprehensive look at what the existing landscape was like in terms of species population numbers within the plan area, but in terms of a concentrated effort to look at one property at one time, I would have to say probably not, except for Coyote Ridge, which Creekside's been working on for a long time.
Well, another resource might be, and I don't even know if they have any records still, the Gavilan Water District that was, that operated Uvis and Chesbro. Way long time ago, but when it was a separate entity by itself. And I don't know what, but it would just be, as we're talking about, was the red-legged frog really around here?
Yes.
The burrowing owl, and there's.
They were, yes. There were more of them in the valley at one time. Stock ponds have become de facto habitat for red-legged frogs, though we did find them in streams at up on Richmond Ranch. Heath may know more about this than I do. He's a botanist, but he's a good overall ecologist, I would say. But the burrowing owl, the population fluctuated. There was an explosion of the birds when a lot of the orchards disappeared. There was a lot of open land in North San Jose. As development has come in, the population has shrunk substantially, unfortunately for them and for us. But I don't think historically there was as many burrowing owls in the plan area as there was when there was this more burrowing owl-friendly habitat that existed when a lot of the orchards went away. But there used to be a lot more frogs, and but the burrowing owl population across the state is in decline. With the frog and the CTS, yeah, there used to be a lot more of them, for sure. Yeah. You have anything to add, or?
No, just don't don't mention kip fox.
Right.
Over to Hollister.
Right.
I found that the presentation fantastic. Your slides were great. I mean, I could see you, selling those framed for people to put in their house.
you guys to have something nice to look at.
No. I mean, it was wonderful, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and the survey with us tonight.
My pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity, for sure.
Thank you, Heath. Good job. Yeah.
Ed, it's your
So it's a
show.
hard act to follow, but I'll go through this relatively quickly. So we'll have the final, so the first item I wanted to talk about in my executive report, executive officer report, was to just talk to, update you a little bit on the budget. So we'll have the final numbers in September, but based on some fees that are coming in from Gilroy and what we know to date, the estimated actual revenues from mitigation fees are almost 11 million. It's 10.8 million. And we had projected 5.5 million, so we nearly doubled what we thought was going to happen. And the big reason why was there was a couple San Jose projects that had been kind of sitting out there for years, and finally they came in, and I stopped guessing on assuming it would come in the fiscal year. When I stopped anticipating it, that's when it came in. So
Put it in the bank for next year. And the year
yeah,
after.
exactly. So we had we had the year we expected we were going to have last year. So it finally happened, but so we had a very robust year. For grants, the Section 6 grant, we finally were awarded it, I think at the last meeting of the PAC. We were concerned about the Department of Interior and Secretary Zinke holding up all the grants, and finally our grant was, along with the other Section 6 grant awards across the country, were released. So we now can show some really positive numbers, which are consistent to what we projected for grants. So that reflects a Wildlife Conservation Board match of $2 million. They usually match the Section 6 grants. And the other 100,000 are local assistant grants from the state, which are for scientific research primarily. So overall, our revenues, both from grants and mitigation fees, were not, nearly 15 million. So it was a very good year. We anticipated 9.5, so we exceeded that. The projections for next year are where I hope I'm wrong. That's going to be 5 million, but I don't expect another 10.8. There's some. The 4 million is not, in grants, is not reflecting money coming from the Section 6 program. I think there's too much political uncertainty for this fiscal year to make that assumption. So that's reflecting hopefully money from the Water District, money from Moore Foundation, and other state grant programs. So if we do get a Section 6 grant, great. Then that number may go up. But what we went through this year to try to, on money that was appropriated by Congress, a Republican Congress, but this administration plays by different rules. So from the state standpoint, Prop 68 passing was a big deal for conservation in general and parks also. And there was, so the park and water bond, I paid less attention to the water part of this proposition, but there is money for water projects and restoration. Maybe we'll see river parkways and urban stream programs coming out again from the state. When I worked in Placer County, those helped us fund a lot of projects, both in the Sierras and in the Valley. So there will be, within this Prop 68, there was 52 million specifically for NCCPs. And that's something we lobbied hard for, along with our other partners in the California HCP Coalition. And turning to page 2, you just see some of the funding areas. I put that in there for your own interest and kind of get an idea of how the money's being split up. As you can see, there's a lot of money for flood improvements too, so I'm sure the Water District will be applying for some of that. I mentioned the Section 6 award finally. So the status of fiscal year 2019 funding for the Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Program. Administration proposed 0. House appropriations was 53.5. Senate appropriations was 49. From what I understand, it's likely that we would get the 53.5. So the Republican-controlled Senate Appropriations and House Appropriations Committee thinks this is an important program. I, along with representatives from Texas, Defenders of Wildlife, and from Florida and California, met with the appropriation committees, both Democrat and Republican, and this is one program that has really bipartisan support. I'm not sure why Secretary Zinke is not a fan of this. I don't think President Trump necessarily has an opinion on this program one way or another. I know there's budget cuts across the board. Maybe they view this as a program where they can cut it. They are cutting the budget from the Endangered Species Program of Fish and Wildlife. Well, that's involved with listings. They're not. I think there's going to be a real slowdown in new listings of species. That doesn't affect us, but it's definitely, potentially a concern. So on to land acquisitions, the same-os that I've probably been talking to you about. Hopefully we're going to get Clara enrolled in the reserve system. Unfortunately, County Parks thinks somehow enrollment in the reserve system means a restriction on recreation. That's not true. If that had been the case, OSA wouldn't have agreed to enroll Coyote Ridge into the reserve system. The wildlife agencies looked at tentative trail maps for Rancho San Vicente. They approved every trail alignment when they met with County Parks. I think it's just a fear on their part. We're hoping to get beyond that fear. I've asked for the help of Supervisors Smidian and Wasserman to get us out of this impasse. So hopefully within the next 6 months or so, I'll be telling you that Calero's finally enrolled and we can start implementing some of Heath's recommendations. It's been, I have a lot of respect for my colleagues at County Parks, but this has been an extraordinarily frustrating process. And something that was voted on by the county supervisors and something that was an expectation of both the wildlife agencies and all the co-permittees that this land would be set aside and managed for multiple use, both wildlife conservation, wildlife management, and recreation. So Shingle Valley, that's the rest of the United Technology Corporation property, not all of it, not the contaminated lands, but where it's moving at a snail's pace. I also had a meeting with IBM. Julie, I know you'd be interested in that. They're open to doing working with us to do owl management out there and trying to improve their lands for owls. I did mention the E word to them, easements. They've said other people have talked to them about their lands, but they are going to at least talk to higher ups about that. I'm not optimistic, but I couldn't help myself. I had to bring it up. So they have a lot of rare plants out there, so I'd love to get somebody like Heath out there to do some survey work, but small steps.
Talking about the Bailey property?
Both of them, yeah. Bailey and Harry Road, yeah. And they have a couple thousand acres, right? I think. Yeah, Almaden, right. So we're in negotiations with the city of San Jose about enrolling at least part of the buffer lands, which has the burrowing owl. It has the Cardin's tar plant on it also. It's not a covered species for us, but it is a rare California plant. So I said that for Heath's benefit. He may have already known that, though. But there's also something to talk, and the owl people are going to come in at I think the next meeting in November. They've been doing supplemental feeding, and there's been a lot of success with supplemental feeding. One, we had no owls breeding at Shoreline last year. This year, there was 2 breeding pairs. One had 9 chicks, another had 6. They also did breeding at Moffett, or supplemental feeding at Moffett with great success. We didn't do it at the Warm Springs or the regional waste facility, but you could see the difference between doing supplemental feeding. There was larger clutches and more successful breeding, generally speaking. So it's the results so far on that research is successful. So the others, some of them I can't really talk to you about. We're doing an appraisal on one property, and we're about to close on another property. It's a small one, but it has the rare plants on it, so you can sort of figure out maybe where it is. I'll give you a clue. It's in the county, so it's
Thanks.
yeah. There's also, we're partnering with OSA on another acquisition. Hopefully, it's in the early stages of negotiation, and it would be a real big one if they're successful in pulling it off. So, and we would be a major funder. So that's kind of what's in the pipeline. We tried, there was a lot of hit and misses with our, I think last meeting I showed you the flyer that we sent out to nearly 400 landowners. Unrealistic expectations on price with a couple of them. Some were just ultimately not good fits. We took tours of the property. Some people were interested in the conservation easement side of things, but they got some cold feet, I think. I probably scared them or something. I said something probably that scared them, but they, so we went out to a couple properties. One was near Henry Coe Park, and we had a good conversation with the landowner there. And but I was thinking we were going to get a conservation easement there, but it hasn't materialized. Yeah. So Grant Park, they're doing construction now on San Felipe Creek. Jerry was out there last week, and the construction crews are now starting to do that project, and it's a big construction project. So the overall project's probably about 1.7 million. So it's quite a they're creating and restoring over 3 acres of seasonal wetlands, over a mile of stream, and doing some wetland restoration, and so it's and doing some of the stuff that Heath would recommend in trying to extend try to put more canopy cover in the riparian. It's in the main valley that used to be a farm. What is it called? Halls Valley? Yeah, Halls Valley. I don't know if you would know that. Yeah, okay.
They've done burns there in a couple of the last 5 years.
Yeah,
or something.
exactly. Yeah, it's the area where they've been doing the burns, right? Yes. Accidental one this year? Okay. So, also, as I mentioned earlier, I gave a presentation at the Cattlemen's Association. Their meeting in Gilroy. It was fun. I had dinner with them and had a beer and gave a presentation. Just one beer to make sure. And no, the beer was on their dime, so they bought my dinner. But they were a good group, and it was I enjoyed the evening, and it was good. They had a lot of good questions, just like you guys. So, yep. So thank you.
Does anyone have any questions on Ed's report or anything that you'd like to see on an upcoming agenda?
So I just wanted to follow up a little bit with Doug's request around assessments. I'm more than happy to take this conversation offline, but I was thinking there might be a way that we can approach that subject in an interesting, more compact way that would sort of give us maybe some sort of overview. I'm not saying for the next meeting, but just to, enlighten us a little bit. I don't think it's really any of our areas. So maybe we can, like I said, I can take the conversation offline, but try and find a way in which we can have some sort of, like I said, presentation, just to sort of bring us a little bit more into the fore on the scientific side of things.
Sure, yes, I was trying to figure out who would be a good person to give that presentation. It wouldn't be me. I took the CRAM course with Aaron, actually, but I'm not the one to talk about it. So I'm trying to figure out who might be the appropriate person to sort of go over all these different techniques for stream assessments. There's Rosgen, which is very used by a lot of geomorphologists and environmental engineers for stream restoration. There's CRAM. There's others I don't know about, but and then there's different ones for ponds. You can use CRAM for ponds too. So, and then there's the ones that Heath referred to, which are very, species driven. So the problem with CRAM, it's not very good for species stuff. So, but I'm trying to figure out who'd be a good one to present. Who would understand all these approaches and could educate me too, and the committee as well, and Doug, and provide it in a way where it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like that because, well, for the water district, I know they use CRAM. I've heard it before, but I'm not versed in it. And I think maybe what might be helpful is in the production of everything, knowing where we have used them, some of these assessment methods, and also maybe a matrix that would be helpful as to, why you use them, where you use them, so it's a really easy sort of cheat sheet for us.
Yeah.
And just picking up on what Julie just said, that it seems as though it would be smart if everyone was working off the same template, on assessments, so the same thing is covered, and then we can compare. But from what I kind of understood is that's not happening.
With owls, everybody's going from the same template. We have Creekside because they live out at Creek on Coyote Ridge, so we've worked with them at Coyote Ridge. There is some differences between what Nomad has done and what Creekside has done. Both Tara and I like the work that Nomad had done at Clara. I guess Heath, is there major differences between your approach on Clara versus Creekside's on Coyote Ridge?
Boy, I'd have to review their report again.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
heavily relied on extrapolation. That sort of technique.
And then one question on the possible land acquisition. Sergeant Ranch is no longer on.
I had a phone call today with TNC and Post. It's not dead, but the applicant is still moving forward with the Corey project. There's a lot of cultural resource issues out there. You probably saw the articles in the Morgan Hill Times, the for and against. I know it's back.
No, the DEIR will be out by the end of the year. It's expected probably December that we'll be looking at, but I understand, yes, you're correct. The cultural resources portion of it was very intensive and may play still a big role in what happens there.
It really is.
It's amazing.
Save.
What we have a fantastic aerial view of it, and this is not a plug, but I've just seen a draft of Committee for Green Foothills newsletter coming up, and we have our main article is going to be on Sargent Ranch, and we have this beautiful aerial of it. It really gives you the breadth of that property and how it borders the different counties. So yeah, it's an amazing property.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think it's, from a ranching heritage standpoint and from a natural heritage standpoint and a cultural native peoples standpoint, I would like, I'd like to see it stay as is. It's up to the county to decide. I don't mean to be so non-committal, but like the Water District, the county is a co-permittee, and how the Planning Commission and the Board of Soups decide whether to support this project or not is up to them. But I would like to see it remain as a cattle ranch and as a natural habitat. So.
Thank you. And so at, let me see, 2 minutes before, so then at 8:46 or 8:47, we'll adjourn the meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
Or no, 7.